Good afternoon. It's 2:15. I guess we have to go here. It's profs coming. You know, we have to start on time. Bonjour à tous. Merci d'être venus. Mon nom est Diane-Laure Arjaliès. I'm the faculty lead of the Sustainable Finance Lab at Ivey Business School, Western University. We're just 2 hours south. We're between Toronto and Detroit, for those who don't know where we are. I'm really glad to be today and moderating this wonderful panel. And you're here at the Academic Conference Network. And so you're going to listen to papers and academic papers and some also practitioners' feedback. So today, we're going to have 3 papers, 1 academic discussant and 1 practitioner discussant. We are on a very tight schedule, so bear with me, I will have to move on, but we have this timer here. So the first paper will be by Nadya Malenko, who is a professor of finance at Boston College. It's about custom proxy voting advice, so that would be a very interesting discussion. The second paper is by Vishaal Baulkaran, who's associate professor of finance at Dhillon School of Business, University of Lethbridge. And the topic is environmental violations, Indigenous and minority population. Just to remind everyone here in Canada, since 2015, we are on the process of truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous community. So it's a really important topic. And we're going to have our practitioner discussant from Coast Farms working with Indigenous communities over in BC. And paper number 3 is Yasser Boualam, with a visiting assistant professor of finance, Wharton School of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And the topic is population shifting versus downscaling, pollution shifting, versus downscaling, how financial distress affects the green transition. Academic discussants, the first one, will be Adriana Robertson, who is Donald Pritzker Professor of Business Law at University of Chicago Law School. And our practitioner discussion is Eddy Adra, Chief Executive Officer of Coast Farms. So I just want to remind you who we are and what we have academics here. So the academic networks have more than 13,000 plus academics and practitioners. So it's a very global network. You will have at the end a lot of some QR codes that you can go and have information on papers. You are really lucky to listen to those 3 papers because we received 200 papers for the Academic Network Conference, and we only selected 12 out of the 200. So you really have, we say in French, la crème de la crème. So really, really happy to welcome. And I guess I'm going to open the floor to Nadya. Thank you.
Is there a clicker? Oh, that's the clicker, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for having our paper on the program and to all of you for being here. This is joint work with Eddy and John Zitnik. And in this paper, we try to understand a little bit better the decision-making process through which institutional investors arrive at their voting decisions, including on issues important to this audience, ESG. And in the academic literature, with very few exceptions, we usually only observe voting outcomes. So in this paper, we use the data from a major proxy advisor, Glass Lewis, to understand a bit better how institutions arrive at their voting decisions. As you, of course, know, proxy advisors are companies that sell research and voting recommendations to institutional investors. And they have been a subject of considerable debate among academics and policymakers. However, the literature and regulatory discussions, they typically focus on what is called benchmark recommendations of these proxy advisors. These are the baseline recommendations that are not tailored to individual shareholders, and these are the recommendations we see announced in media when we talk about what proxy advisors recommend. These are the ones that have been used in the academic literature. In contrast, in this paper, we will be focusing on recommendations that are customized to investors. So an institutional investor would formulate their voting policies, communicate them to the proxy advisor, and those voting policies and guidelines would affect the recommendations that the proxy advisor would give to the investor. So for example, an investor might have views on ESG issues that differ from the benchmark standard recommendations of the proxy advisor. That would be a reason to customize the recommendations. In particular, the questions we try to answer is this use of proxy advisors by institutions, and in particular, is customization common? Which investors choose to customize and why? And then we try to understand how customization interacts with investors' attention to voting issues. A common concern about investors' use of proxy advisors is that it may crowd out independent research by institutional investors, and that would undermine this wisdom of the crowd idea that we want many independent signals to arrive at the best voting decisions. So we try to understand whether customization can crowd out independent research and, or it can actually facilitate it. We study these questions using proprietary data from Glass Lewis, the second largest proxy advisor. So what are our conclusions? First of all, we see that customization is widespread. 80% of funds use some form of customized proxy advice. And we show that custom recommendations often differ from benchmark recommendations provided by the proxy advisor. Customizations, we conclude, serves two purposes. First, it allows investors to express their ideologies through the vote. And in that sense, it allows this aggregation of different investors' views and ideologies and preferences in the votes. And second, with respect to paying attention, we find that it reallocates investors' attention. It allows investors to reduce their attention to each individual proposals, but instead to allocate their attention to more important contentious issues where additional research would be particularly valuable. And in that sense, it both substitutes and complements attention to voting. So the sample are all institutional investors that use Glass Lewis's voting platform, and this is an anonymized sample. For each of the funds, we observe its customization status as of 2022. We don't observe the actual recommendations that are given to the institution, but we'll have a way to understand whether they differ from benchmark recommendations. We also observe the voting data for the fund, in particular whether it deviates from benchmark recommendations on at least one proposal on the ballot. And the way it works is that the fund's ballot in the system is pre-populated with the recommendations it receives, custom or benchmark. However, the fund can always enter the system and manually enter the vote, in particular deviate, or confirm the recommendation. If it doesn't manually vote, its vote will be auto-submitted on a pre-specified date according to this pre-populated recommendation. So we observe the auto-submission dates that funds specify, and we also observe the actual submission date of the votes. And by comparing the two, we can classify the votes into those that were manually submitted by the fund and those that were auto-submitted. And we use that as a proxy for funds' attention to voting. So this is the baseline descriptive statistics. As you can see, about 78% of funds that are customers of Glass Lewis use some form of customized advice. The majority of them, the red part, use advice that is tailored to their individual ideology. About 1% use what we call ready-made recommendations. These are policies that are predetermined by the proxy advisor, say ESG or pro-management policy, and the fund just subscribes to those policies. The proxy advisor doesn't need to do any additional customization. This is Glass Lewis data, but as we know from ISS itself, 86% of the shares that are voted by ISS on behalf of its clients also are linked to custom voting policies. So these numbers are consistent. Do custom recommendations differ from benchmark? As I mentioned, we don't observe the custom recommendations themselves, but we can classify votes into auto-submitted and those that are not. And if we focus on truly auto-submitted votes, they would correspond to custom recommendations. So by comparing those auto-submitted votes for customizers and non-customizers, as we do in this table, we can compare how often custom recommendations differ from benchmark. And as you can see in the first column, for non-customizers, those auto-submitted votes coincide with benchmark recommendations in 95%, so very close to 100%. There is a degree of error in our classification of auto-submission. But this number is much lower for customizers. And in the background calculation, we estimate that custom recommendations differ from benchmark in more than 20% of fund ballots based on this table. To understand what the implications for the voting process are, we have a conceptual framework in the paper where we think of the fund's decision-making process as happening in two stages. At the first stage, prior to the proxy season, a fund decides whether to customize, and if it does, it formulates its voting policy and communicates it to the proxy advisor. And at the second stage, that happens during the proxy season already for each individual firm and each individual proposal. The fund receives this recommendation and then can decide ex post whether to pay additional attention and to conduct additional research, and then how to vote next. So this framework produces a few implications that we verify in the data. First, which funds will be more likely to customize? Very intuitively, this will be the funds whose ideology differs from those of the proxy advisor. Otherwise, benchmark recommendations would be sufficient. And as you can see in this graph, which plots what we construct as environmental and social score, the support, based on the support rate of the fund for environmental and social proposals relative to Glass-Lewis, this is indeed the case. There is a big mass of funds whose ideology is very similar to Glass-Lewis's. That's the zero, the mass at zero, while the orange graphs, which capture customizers, show that there is much more variation in investors' ideology if they customize relative to Glass-Lewis. We also predict and confirm in the data that there is an economies of scale argument. If a fund has many portfolio firms, it makes sense to pay this cost up front, the extra cost of customization, and then the proxy advisor would apply those custom recommendations to all firms in the portfolio. And it's more important to customize if just voting is more important to the fund. For example, the fund is larger, has a larger average stake in portfolio firms. And again, we see that in the data. Next, we study the interaction with attention to voting, or independent research. And what we predict is that for non-contentious proposals, the fund will conduct less research if it customizes. And that's very intuitive. Customization takes care of the characteristics of the proposal and of the firm that are very important to the fund specifically. So there is less need to do research on those characteristics. However, we also predict that for contentious proposals, the fund conduct more research than if it didn't customize. And the idea is customization can serve as an alert and alert the fund to those proposals where additional research would be particularly valuable. It also frees up the attention budget by being able to focus less on the less contentious proposals. The fund can allocate more attention to the important proposals. So in that sense, there is both substitution and a complementarity effect. So for the substitution effect, let me show you just one graph. This graph plots on the x-axis the fund's rate of manual voting, which is a proxy for how often the funds pay attention. And on the y-axis, we have the deviation from the Glass-Lewis benchmark recommendations. And you can see that the blue line, this is the line for customizers, lies higher than the orange line, which means for the same rate of manual voting, for the same intensity of paying attention, you can deviate much more from Glass-Lewis's recommendations if you customize, which is consistent with substitution. We also do other analysis, so we find that within institutions, whenever there is variation across funds within a given institution, funds that customize, they pay less attention to voting compared to funds that non-customize, again consistent with substitution. I'll skip that test in the interest of time. For complementarity, what we would predict is this reallocation of attention, that the fund pays more attention for important proposals, less attention for less important proposals. So that would predict that the sensitivity of attention to important proposals would be higher for customizers than for non-customizers. And we do find it in the data when we look at proposals like proxy, as those associated with an activist, special meetings, or meetings where one of the proxy advisors recommended against management. So let me summarize and talk about some implications. I think this paper provides a different perspective on investors' use of proxy advisors, and in particular it suggests that institutions actually play an active role in shaping the recommendations they receive rather than just passively receiving them. Customization is widespread. It serves two purposes. It helps investors express their ideologies, and it helps them reallocate their attention more efficiently. And in that sense, proxy advisors help both aggregation of preferences, but they also affect this information aggregation. And in terms of implications, one suggestion is just to reduce the exclusive focus on benchmark recommendations, given how widespread customization is. It also speaks to SEC's discussions of banning pre-populated voting choices. And the idea is banning such choices could discourage the use of customization, and that could actually backfire because it would increase the reliance on this one single benchmark recommendations, and paradoxically, given our complementarity results, could reduce deliberation on important proposals. And finally, customization and the use of ready-made policies as well could be becoming more important given the growing use of pass-through voting. That's how institutions often engage in pass-through voting by using those custom voting policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, merci. Perfect. So now paper 2 on unretold violations, Indigenous and minority population.
Okay, thank you. This is joint work with my co-author from Environment Canada. And essentially, we're looking at environmental justice. Environmental justice has sort of emerged quite a while, but more recently in Canada, Bill C-2222, proposed by the Green leader, wants to look at a law to crack down on environmental racism. Now, we're not looking at racism per se, we're just looking at this whole idea of injustice in certain economic group. Okay, so I'll preview the result just in case I run out of time. What do we find? We find that census subdivision with higher percentage of indigenous population experience higher non-compliance rates for 3 different measures of non-compliance. We also find that census subdivision with visible minority, more visible minority experience higher non-compliance rate as well. We do not find income or unemployment mediating this effect. In the literature with pollution, income tends to mediate pollution. We do not find that when it comes to violation. So in terms of environmental justice, there's a whole bunch of theories proposed to explain environmental justice. In the sense of pollution. For our paper on the enforcement side, we're going to look at, we're going to use 2 theories, the distributional justice and the urban political theory. The distributional justice theory simply says that environmental risk is not evenly distributed across communities. Okay? The urban political ecology says that what happens in the environment today depends a lot on capitalist behavior, on institutions and activities, and power structure within society. So this is more on the income side and the unemployment side. There is quite a bit of research on the pollution side. Some of the evidence in support of what we're doing, and some mix. So in North America, for example, there is some disparity in who face pollution the most. In Europe, the results are mixed. What we focus on is on the enforcement side of things. Here, the literature is very, very limited. And in the US, for example, the literature doesn't really show this, there's a disparity in enforcement activities across communities. The difference between ours and these, most of these studies tend to be focusing on a specific industry or a short period of time. Ours is going to look at all enforcement activity in Canada and over a longer period of time. So we use the distributional justice theory to come up with 2 hypotheses, and we use the mixed evidence in the literature to formulate the 3rd hypothesis. So the first 2 deals with who bears most of the violations, and the 3rd one is whether income level sort of mediate some of that effect. So our data, we use 4 sources. So StatsCan data for the census and macroeconomic data. We use the enforcement data from Environment Canada. And the 2 that Environment Canada, the 2 act is the Environment Protection Act and the Fisheries Act. We control for pollution level based on the literature, and we divide our group, our economic units into census subdivision according to Stats Canada. However, we take a border of 20 kilometers around the boundaries of each census subdivision, and I'll show you why we do that in a second. So here's a census subdivision in red. So if you look at that, there is no facility within that subdivision. But a 20-kilometer radius around that subdivision, this is somewhere in Alberta, there's 4 facilities within that 20 kilometer. Chances are they're upriver or downriver, upwind or downwind, and the pollution, of course, is going to flow to that community. So there's some literature to look at 30 and 40, but we decided on 20 kilometers. So here's an example of our violation data. So for example, Surrey is a census subdivision. In 2011, they had 450 monitoring activities. So an environmental officer went and actually examined facilities in that subdivision. There were 66 violations in total. Of that, 14 were serious violations. Serious violation is Schedule 1 toxic chemicals. It's about 100 of those that Environment Canada takes really serious. And of course, a subset of that is water body violations, some of that ends up in rivers and lakes. So you can see sort of the trend in terms of the violation or non-compliance rates. So we also control for pollution level. We use MPRI data. So for example, the same subdivision in 2011 had 152 facilities that were monitored by Environment Canada for a total of 1 million kilogram of total releases. Schedule 1 toxic, just about 81 facilities for about 4,000 kilogram, and we calculate a ratio to total, which we use in our control variables. Since a lot of our data is truncated at 0 or in some cases 1, we use a TOBIT model, clustered the standard errors at the subdivision level and year and province fixed effects. And we have a whole bunch of control variables. I'll talk a little bit about those in a second. So let me just skip this. I want to show an interesting graph. So we have the average pollution by buckets of Indigenous population. And of course, we have the non-compliance rate on the other axis. And as you can see, as Indigenous population increases, even though the average pollution is going down, the actual violation, percentage of violation is actually increasing. Okay, so this is for the serious violations. Water body, which again is a bit surprising, given what's happening a lot in Indigenous communities, it's not as clear-cut, even though there is still a little bit more on the higher end of 90 and 100%, where there is a little bit more violations as the level of pollution discharge decreases. So we did 2 main regressions. The first one is we said there must be at least 1 monitoring activity in a census subdivision per year to be in our data. So if you can see, for visible minority, the greater the visible minority, the higher the violation. Similarly, for Indigenous population, greater the Indigenous population, higher the violation, except for water body, which was very surprising to us. We were expecting that to be significant as well. Unemployment, so the economic variables, unemployment is in the direction based on the literature. However, median income is not significant, which in the pollution literature is strongly significant in explaining, negative and significant in explaining pollution. And we control for a host of macroeconomic factors. We also a condition on having at least 3 monitoring activity. When we do this, we lose about 4,000 observations, and the results are very similar. We figure, well, okay, income didn't matter in the main regression, but what if income is a moderating effect? So when we interact income with visible minority as well as Indigenous population, and it didn't come out significant still. So income in our setup is not relevant to some extent. We did a bunch of robustness check. I'm going to jump ahead here, and I want to talk about one additional analysis that we did. When my co-author presented this to a group of directors at Environment Canada, one of the directors stood up and said, well, you know what's happening? A lot of the violations that we see in the Indigenous communities in particular are related to storage tank, fuel storage tanks, and not potentially not facilities, because a lot of these use fuel for generators for electricity and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, we can't identify the ownership of the fuel storage tank. So what we did was we take out all the storage tank and we run the analysis, and then we run the analysis on fuel storage tanks only violation. So ex-fuel storage tank, just as suspected, indigenous population is actually negative and significant. So when you take out fuel storage tank from that violation data, indigenous population violation is actually the opposite direction. But when you look at just fuel storage tank violation, it's very strongly significant. So the sort of the policy implication here that we talked about, and so what was happening is inspectors are going, they're finding violations, but these communities don't have the resources to actually remedy that situation. So they're getting repeat violations over and over, especially when it comes to fuel leaking into the soil or into water that's related to these tanks that are pretty old. Now, we did a sort of a back of the envelope sort of an assessment with a student, a master's student. About half of those fuel storage tanks are indigenous. We had 1 year of data, and about half are not. So it's not all indigenous fuel storage tank when it comes to column 2. When we look at the data, we saw that a big percentage, about 5,000, 6,000 observation, year CSD observation that got dropped. So we're thinking, what's going on? And it turns out there's CSDs, even though there's pollution data, there's no inspection activities. So our additional research that we're working on right now is why is that the case? So we want to figure out what factors influence monitoring activities from Environment Canada, and this is something that is policy driven by them. But from my selfish interest is why some of those CSD are never inspected, even though they have polluting facilities. Because we know they have polluting facilities because we have the MPRI data that says X tons of pollution has been pumped into the environment that year. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Paper 3, yes, sir.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to participate at the PRI and to present this research, which I joined with my co-author, Émeric Bellon. In this paper, we ask a very important and broad question, which is how do financing conditions affect corporate pollution? When you think about sustainable investing, one common and dominant strategy therein is to divest from dirty sectors such as fossil fuel industry. Now, this narrative typically takes as given the firm's operation. What we're going to argue in this paper is that environmental decisions at the corporate level are also going to be evolving with financing conditions, and this may create what I call a countervailing force, which is pollution shifting. The idea here is that as financing costs increase, not only firm size decline, but firms may also start to shift their operations and assets towards the more polluting ones. So downscaling effects affect the size, and the pollution shifting effect is going to affect the pollution intensity at the firm level. Now, the mechanism that we have in mind here is that polluting assets are less costly to operate, but also more risky in the sense that they expose firms to environmental liability such as lawsuit, cleanup costs, or future regulations. And so as financing conditions deteriorate, firm managers become more and more short-termist in nature, start cutting costs, lower their abatement efforts, and take on more risk, which may lead to this pollution shifting effects. Now, when most of these costs are dischargeable in bankruptcy and you have limited liability, you might see this effect showing up. Now, in light of these countervailing forces between the size effect and the pollution intensity effect, we want to take the extensive and intensive margin of pollution seriously, and we're going to investigate empirically the properties of these two margins, using the oil and gas industry as our empirical setting. Second, we're going to develop and calibrate a novel quantitative model that's going to serve us as a laboratory to test and quantify the environmental effects of ESG strategies through their impact on financing conditions. All right. Our empirical setting is going to be the oil and gas industry, and in particular, we're going to focus on US companies engaged in fracking. So fracking consists of a number of negative environmental externalities. For example, we have toxic chemical releases which may contaminate the ground and the waterway, and so we want to measure that. And we also have a big problem, which is flaring. Flaring consists of burning that unwanted natural gas that may come as a byproduct of oil extraction. So for flaring, we don't have a federally mandated database or reporting, so we're going to use here some really cool satellite imaging data that will help us identify very precisely the regions on the ground where you're going to have some flaring happening. Now, our identifying assumption in this paper is going to rely on some key institutional features of the oil and gas industry, in particular, the fact that project-level marginal costs and benefits of polluting are the same for two wells or two projects that are drilling in the very same area in the very same year. So essentially what we're going to do, we're going to take two companies that are drilling in the same locations, subject to the same costs and benefits, and we're going to look at how differences in their financing conditions affect their environmental choices. On the one hand, some companies may choose to flare, other companies may, for example, choose to connect their well to a natural gas pipeline. So let me now tell you a little bit about the empirical results. We're going to look at the relationship between financing conditions, financial distress, and pollution intensity along three different kind of aspects. Let me start by just showing you here the cross-section. I'm going to plot here a bin scatter with pollution measures on the y-axis and the distress measures on the x-axis. One of the distress measures that we use is the z-score. You can see here a negative relationship between the z-score and the probability of pollution. So as the z-score comes down, which signals higher financial distress, the probability that the firm is polluting increases as well. Now, we're also going to use the time dimension and the high-frequency nature of the data to do some event studies. One of the event studies that we do is around bankruptcy events. One of the key results we find there is that in the aftermath of a Chapter 11 filing, you see a decline in pollution intensity levels by about 30%, consistent with the fact that after Chapter 11 filing and debt restructuring, firms regain some financial flexibility, pushing them away from financial distress and from any motive to pollution shifts. Also look at that by developing a continuous measure of default probability and running a lead-lag specification with default probability on the right-hand side and pollution intensity on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side. And what we find is a strong relationship with pollution intensity around well completion, consistent with the idea that environmental decisions are made at that particular time, given the level of financial distress that the company has. We push that a little bit further by splitting our sample into low versus high liability risk regions based on the lawsuit climate survey. What we find is that the relationship between default probability and pollution is particularly stronger for high-risk regions, again, consistent with our risk-shifting motive. Now, in the second part of the paper, and building on these stylized facts, what we do is build a dynamic corporate finance model featuring endogenous leverage and default, and where we allow companies to choose between dirty versus clean assets. The core assumption there is that clean capital or clean assets require a fixed maintenance cost per period. Think about that as abatement costs. On the other hand, dirty capital requires no operating cost, but you are subject to potentially hefty fine in the future if you get caught. What's really novel in the model is that pollution intensity becomes a dynamic and persistent state variable that's going to react to firm characteristics, such as firm size, capital structure, default probability, etc. And these different firm characteristics are also going to feed back and respond to the level of pollution intensity of the firm. In the model, we're also going to introduce financing frictions in the form of equity and debt issuance cost, which will serve as a proxy for divestment effects and investor preferences. All right, so based on the model, we're going to calibrate the model, and then we're going to run a few counterfactuals. The first counterfactual that we're going to run is going to reflect blanket divestments. Obviously, blanket divestment is something that is very popular. I'm sure many people in the audience belong to companies that are committed to divesting from fossil fuels. And this is a policy that has been encouraged by policymakers, regulators, and central bankers alike. We're going to try to mimic the effect of this policy by increasing the issuance costs that the firms are exposed to. So you can increase that on the debt side or the equity side, and I'm going to show you here a figure related to our debt issuance counterfactual. And this is our headline figure. I'm going to go here from the left-hand side to the right-hand side and increase the debt issuance costs. What are the effects? I want you first to see the blue dashed line, which represent that downscaling effect. As I increase the issuance costs, firms find it harder and harder to take on more debt. They're going to invest less. Their size is going to come down. So this is the intended effect. But now I also want you to look at the red dashed line, which represents pollution intensity. As we increase this debt issuance costs, firms become more and more in distress, and that's going to lead to that pollution shifting effect that's going to undo the downscaling channel. So all in all, if you look at the black dashed line, you see that up to 0.5 increase in debt issuance costs, there is pretty much no effect, but then that finally comes down as the pollution shifting mechanism actually starts to come down. And so the message here is that if you really want to create an impact through divestments, this needs to happen on a large scale. So we need some sort of kind of coordination among creditors, investors, and regulators in a more global way. So this is an increase in the uniform issuance costs. Now we can also think about other policies or strategies that penalize the dirty firms and that subsidizes the cleanest one within an industry. So you can think about that as like a tilting strategy in equity investment fund, or you can also think about that in terms of financial instruments such as sustainability-linked bonds. And what we highlight here is that by creating this wedge between polluting assets and maybe cleaner ones, we are creating an additional financial incentives for companies to select the green investments. Okay, and the effects here are actually very large and can bring eventually the pollution at the corporate level much lower compared to just a uniform increase in issuance costs. We'd see the same thing if we were to think about policies on the real side of the equation. For example, penalizing the sale of dirty assets versus clean assets. All right, so let me just conclude. What we do in this paper, we build a granular pollution data set accounting for both toxic releases and flaring for the oil and gas industry, and we show a number of stylized facts along the intensive and extensive margin of pollution. The most important fact being that pollution intensity increases with financial distress. Second part of the paper, we calibrate a dynamic model with leverage, default, and clean and dirty capital to run some counterfactuals. Now, just to put the paper into a general context of the literature, so far we have seen mixed evidence on the effect of divestment on the cost of capital. Some papers say no, other papers say yes. There's also a very important paper that is closely related to ours by Hartzmark and Shui, which was presented here last year, which highlights the fact that impact elasticities are larger for dirty firms. So this paper shares some insight with that Hartzmark and Shui paper. Our message is the following. Despite any increase in the cost of capital, firms may pollution shift as they become financially distressed, and this internal effect may unfortunately undo some of the downscaling effect and ultimately limiting the impact of divestments. We highlight the importance of looking at the intensive versus the extensive margins, and highlight also the fact that if you want divestment to work, it needs to happen with large magnitudes. All right, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, merci, Adriana.
All right, well, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Now you can. Thank you so much to the organizers and for the invitation to discuss these fabulous papers. I have to talk about 3 papers in 11 minutes. So what I'm going to do is not really talk about the 3 papers, because fortunately the authors just did a fabulous job of already telling you what the papers say. And instead, what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about the context in which the papers kind of sit, the literature that they're sort of engaged with, and a little bit about, as I see it, the lessons from the papers and how they kind of, speak to that literature. So, first thing I want to do is tell you, when we had our prep call about this session, the thought was like, oh, these papers are really different. How are you going to discuss them? And I said, what are you talking about? These papers all fit together beautifully. I thought that's why you put them together. So here's how I see the papers fitting together in actually a very logical framework, right? So I'm going to change the sequence in which they were presented around, and then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Right, so the first paper, Custom Proxy Voting Advice, what's that about? It's about top-level corporate governance decision-making. It's about how do the owners of assets decide how to discharge their stewardship obligations, right? So that's the first paper. The second paper is about, governance at the operating company level. That's the pollution shifting versus downscaling paper, right? That's about how do the managers of operating companies make decisions, right? How do they manage in light of everything that's surrounding them? And sometimes what they do is engage in a lot of polluting activities, right? And that's where the third paper in my sequence comes in, right? Because the third paper, Environmental Violations, Indigenous and Minority Populations, is about the downstream effects of those corporate governance decisions, right? So when you put them together in that way, it's like a totally logical sequence that starts from what do asset managers do? How do they set their stewardship? What do managers do in response to the environments in which they find themselves? And what does that then do to people in the real world, right? So I'm going to take the papers in that order, since I think that's the most logical way to think about them. Okay, so let's start with the Custom Proxy Voting Advice paper, right? So I think there's an enormous literature, and every person who pays any attention at all to anything related to capital markets knows that large asset managers have an enormous amount of influence, right? That just kind of table stakes. And the US securities laws, I can't speak for other countries, but certainly the United States, the SEC requires these asset managers to vote shares and engage in stewardship in the interests of investors. Now there's some, complexities around when exactly they have to vote and when they can decide it's not worth it, but we'll take as given that they're required to engage in stewardship. Right? There is a huge literature, right? Nadya kind of alluded to this, about the concerns around the stewardship activities of these large asset managers. Right? So there's a thought that they're underinvesting in stewardship for a wide variety of reasons. They've got to vote like thousands and thousands of proxies during the month or so of proxy season. How on earth are they going to do that? They don't have any great incentives to do it. After all, a lot of these guys are basically selling index-based products. So why would you invest in stewardship when you're only going to be penalized for tracking error? Like, you don't care. Right? The fact that their teams are just not big enough. Right? The thought is, people are not investing in stewardship. Right? And on top of that, we have the rise of the big proxy advisors, right? ISS and Glass Lewis, right? And they are thought in this world to wield enormous influence. Right? And so when you put these things together, what do you get? You get this concern that if the big asset managers are effectively outsourcing, right, their governance decisions to these proxy advisors, then maybe it's the proxy advisors that are the real power behind the throne. Maybe they're the ones that actually run the world. It's not BlackRock, it's ISS and Glass Lewis. Right? That's sort of the fear that a lot of people in the literature have. And there's also sort of suggestions that they might face conflicts of interest, right, because of the structure of their business model and a wide variety of things that you guys probably already know more about than I do. Okay, so that's the context in which this paper is situated. And then what are the big lessons, at least from my perspective as a scholar who works in this area? So first, I think it sheds a lot of insight on how large asset managers are discharging their stewardship obligations. Right? So we've got this theoretical and empirical analysis of the use of custom voting advice, or guidelines, as we sometimes call them, right? So I think folks that work in the space, we've known for a couple of years that these guidelines exist, right? Because you kind of see them in the proxy statements, or you see them, you know, in the prospectuses of these funds, like we use these custom guidelines, but nobody had really paid much attention to them. They were sort of viewed as a bit of a curiosity, and well, they're probably not that important. There's probably only a few of them, and maybe it's only like ESG funds that do it, and there's no capital there. And it turns out that's not true. Turns out they're really, really important, and they're probably much more important than anyone realized. And so it gives us an explanation for why people are doing this, right? We have this theoretical model that helps us better understand. And I think one of the things that I really liked about it was the reasons to believe that there's actually complementarity, right? This is what Nadya talked a little bit about, the complementary relationship between having the custom guidelines and then doing your own individualized research. So if you're worried about stewardship, this paper is like great news, right? This is a reason to be optimistic because the rise of these guidelines means that the big asset managers can just focus in on the particularly contentious votes and save their attention from everything else, right? That sort of attention budget idea. So this is like a happy story. Okay, so that's the first paper, right? Then we get the second paper, right? And so this one fits into this enormous literature on how operating companies respond to financial constraints, right? So this idea, big old literature that, you know, externalities exist, and in particular, there are externalities generated by financial distress, right? And the basic idea, again, this is like the foundational, one of the foundational problems in corporate governance research, is that if a company is in distress, it might take extra risks, right? Why is that? Simple, right? If things work out, the shareholders, well, they get the upside. That's what it means to have limited liability. Managers often own a lot of stock, or maybe they're compensated with options, which makes them even more directly incentivized in that way. Great. And if the risk doesn't pan out, somebody else bears the downside. So when you're sitting at a heads I win, tails you lose, of course you're gonna take risk, right? So that's the basic framework. And what happens in this context is thinking about the externality as being pollution, right? And so, same idea, if a company's teetering on the edge of insolvency, you might as well use more polluting assets, right? Because you're gonna make some money in the short term, and the downside, well, the pollution, maybe there'll be liability down the line. Great, we'll deal with that if we're still around. That's a good news story, it means we're still around, right? That's kind of what the paper is saying. And I also think I just really love the illustration that this paper provides us of the consequences of divestment, right? And so we already heard about this. Basically, starving, dirty companies can actually make them dirtier, right? Because why not just be dirty if the alternative is being insolvent? I think this also dovetails with the first paper in a really nice way, because after all, right, the first paper is about what owners do when they engage in stewardship, right? And so if you divested, you don't own the company, you can't vote any shares, you don't have him. And what you've done is potentially raised the cost of capital for this company, pushed it closer to distress, and then it's gonna pollute more. So there's a double whammy if you put those two together. You can't try to engage in stewardship to improve the situation, and you might actually have made it worse, right? So if you put those two together, it gives us a lot of food for thought, I think. Very quickly, this is a very hot area of research, so there's lots of people working on related types of papers. This is just a plug, shameless plug for a student. This is a student from across the Midway at Booth. He's working on a related paper, so pay attention to this space. There's lots more research coming, and I think it's a super interesting and exciting topic. Okay, third paper now, right? So this is environmental violations, indigenous and minority populations. This is about, as we said, how the decisions of those operating companies, like say the ones teetering on insolvency that engage in more pollution, right? How do those decisions affect communities on the ground? Right? So, you know, even the most careful companies are gonna make mistakes sometimes. There's gonna be some violations. If we put this in econ speak, we would say the optimal number of violations is not 0. Right? But not all companies are optimally careful, and some of them make even more violations than the optimal number would be. And so very standard political economy story suggests that, you know, more powerful groups are better positioned to shape policy around their interests and to exert their rights. Right? And so if it if you think about the world through that basic perspective, or just exercise some common sense, you might think that, well, more powerful groups can protect themselves, more marginalized groups don't have the means to protect themselves, they're going to be bearing those costs, right? And that's just the unfortunate reality, and that's sort of the setting, right, that the paper is looking at. And so the environmental justice movement has done a lot of work to try to highlight the toll on marginalized communities, right, of these choices. And so, the big lesson, right, fairly straightforward. The authors find some evidence that certain types of pollution, right, it's kind of subtle exactly which types, which is part of what makes the paper so interesting, but certain types of pollution are more common in disproportionately Indigenous and minority communities, right, which is of course consistent with this political economy story. You're less able to protect your interests, so you're gonna bear the consequences. Right? And it's also, I think, a good reminder of the real world impact of the decisions from the second paper. Right? So there's that thread again that goes through all three papers. Okay, so wrapping up, because I did only have, whatever it was, 11 minutes, corporate governance decisions, they have real impacts on the world. I think we all know this, but it's nice to be reminded of it from time to time. Decision-making starts at the level of the owner, right? And through their stewardship decisions, shape the incentives and the actions of managers, which in turn has consequences in the real world. Right? And so putting these three papers together, I think, helps us to see the full picture. So I will leave you with that and pass the floor to Eddy.
Thank you. Merci. Eddy, last but not least, then we're going to have 11 minutes of Q&A too. So you have 11 minutes, Eddy.
Thank you. Really humbled to be here today. I don't think I've ever presented in an academic audience, so hope I'm academic enough for you here today, but really excited to be here to talk about the work that we do at Coast Funds and the relationship that it has with these three papers. And I'll actually flip the paradigm over from the way you've presented it in a different way. And just a little bit of Coast Funds. Coast Funds is an Indigenous-led foundation that's been established in 2007, serving First Nations in the Great Bear Rainforest in Haida Gwaii. So from a kind of place perspective, it's on the coast of British Columbia and Canada, on the west coast. And really our vision is for First Nations to be able to exercise their inherent rights to self-determination, ensuring healthy and thriving communities and ecosystem. And so as a funder, we support those nations in their economic development and conservation efforts. And so like I said, I flipped the order of the papers around. I'm actually going to look at the environmental violation paper first, kind of almost the history of Coast Funds and why it was created, talking then about divestments and looking at our own investment approach and why we've moved down from that perspective. And finally, talking about the impacts of custom voting proxies and how we custom proxy voting and how we've done that through our kind of evolution as an organization, as a foundation, and how we go about investing in and using our voice as a value-based investor. And so starting with the first paper, it really was reflective to how Coast Funds was established. Coast Funds was, like I said, created in 2007. It was as a result of environmental violation, as a result of environmental degradation in the region. It was projected that by 2020, the entire region would have had all of their watershed logged. And so in here, I've got a kind of a reminder in Haida language that everything depends on everything else, and the impact that forestation wasn't just on the forest, it was on the streams, it was on the salmon, it was on the people that relied on all of this. And seeing the paper, how it was put together, reflected the continued, I think, environmental injustice that we see today. This was happening over the last 200 years through colonization. This was an impact of terra nullius as a concept of this land belonged to nobody in Canada and North America, actually in all of Americas, and how colonization happened. This continues to happen today, and through the lens of environmental injustice, it's really unfortunate to see that continuation, not only to Indigenous people, but to minority groups. And the paper really reflected that, and it was really impactful for me to go through that understanding and seeing the overall impacts that some of these industry players have. Luckily, we've seen some of the environmental groups and foundations In Canada, both provincially and federally, really working with Indigenous communities in reparations and reconciliation, in making a change, in trying to address some of these concerns. Shifting to kind of the polluting shifting, no pun intended, and downscaling. This was really interesting paper for me to read through. Coast Funds, as a institutional investor, we actually do use a divestment approach to some of these areas. And when I was reading this paper, it was really interesting. To me, the perspective I brought to this concept was, one, as a small organization, funds under management of $400 million, a team of 12 people, I don't have the resources and the energy to go and engage the oil and gas community effectively to be able to enact change. And so as an institutional investor, it's probably not my role to do that, but it's sad to see that I'm having a negative impact on that front. But it's also looking at it from the perspective that as an institutional investor, representing, and maybe not representing, but working in service of 29 First Nations, really, I care about how do I serve my communities best? And how does the income that's generated that's funding those communities best serve those communities? And on the West Coast anyways, it was really important that pipelines, as an example, was a very, very contentious issue. Enbridge tried to build a pipeline across British Columbia through some of these communities, and it was a very important issue for the communities I serve. And so as a divestment strategy, we've made a choice to not invest in Enbridge. However, we've also made the opposite choice of empowering organizations, including Enbridge, who invest in clean energy projects. And so if Enbridge created a company or a subsidiary that invested in clean energy, then we, as a funder, could be able to invest in that. And so we're having a positive impact in the market to really able to grow investments in that sector. And one of the arguments I'd make is, yes, financing cost is a component of that, but the financing cost of the kind of the impact of pollution on divestments, but I think governance is probably also an impact of that. And as companies are making decisions to pollute and increase pollutions, it's also a reflection of their poor governance and the governance models that are established there, and the incentives that these organizations have and companies have to maximize returns in the very short term, kind of that capital market of how do I make a buck today, and not really about the impact to my company and to the communities downstream in the future. And so from our perspective, the opposite was really the kind of a critical component in the establishment of Coast Funds is how do we actually create a positive impact through our investment strategies to both the First Nation communities that we serve, but also to the environment, to the social and governance components in there. And so this is just an example of one of those projects where our infrastructure fund managers acquired a hydro facility in the Tahltan territory, so in northern British Columbia. As it's required in British Columbia, that nation had the ability of first right of refusal to that project. But if you can imagine a $2.5 billion project that's being proposed to be acquired by a community, that's a really hard component to be presented with. And instead, this investment, the infrastructure manager that we work with, took the approach of coming to the community as, if you could invest in this project, would you? And the answer was clearly yes. And so with that, they brought them on board into their bond issuance. And so providing them with access to capital, lowering their finance costs in this process, and providing them actually a board seat. So not only providing them with governance, but providing them with a seat at the board table to be able to have impact, to have influence on a project that was directly impacting their community. And lastly, and this is really interesting because this is, so if your paper was based on 2019, Coast Funds wouldn't have done custom proxy voting. We just relied on the voting recommendations that our investment managers would have had. And what we've done is we were curious about the impact of doing that. And the impact of doing that was actually voting against our principles. And so we've conducted a proxy voting audit on the two equity managers we had, and we found that one manager voted 99% in line with management. The other one was about 90% in line with management. And when you start drilling down in some of the more contentious issues, and doing the research, we found that they're actually voting against our core values. They're voting against proxy votes that are established, that are supporting the rights of Indigenous people. They're voting against proxy votes that are established to provide social empowerments and better ESG reporting and so on and so forth. And so what we ended up doing is in 2019, we started looking elsewhere. Well, who else? What other foundations does custom proxy votings? We actually didn't found that much in the literature at that time, and so we created our own. We decided to just take it in-house, create our own, and we made the decision to not use an external provider to do that, and to do it internally, because that allows us to have that direct relationship with our investment manager, and it changes their behavior. And so instead of, I'll do the research, I'll get the information as to a contentious issue coming through, and before I even pick up the phone, or it's really more an email that I'll reach out to my investment manager telling them about something that's coming down, they're actually emailing me, telling me, Eddy, do you know that this is coming through? We expect you to want to vote for this resolution. Do you agree? And of course I would agree, and it's a really shifting behavior is a really interesting perspective that we see here. And so our approach was really about driving corporate governance changes through our proxy voting approach, and we're starting to see that. It doesn't mean that all of the votes that we vote positively for are winners, but at least our voice is reflected in the market, and the more voices like ours is reflected, the more change we're going to start to see. I've put in a quick QR code in here if you wanted to get a quick snapshot of that, but we don't have time, so I'll skip to the next slide. But you can go on our website. It's all there. Just search proxy voting, and you'll be able to find, actually all of our policies are on our website. And so the 5 guidelines that we've established that we really focus on are the contentious issue that we see here. So we don't have any guidelines about how to choose auditors or board terms and things like that. We rely on ISS to do their job to do it right. But we have some specific areas that we are concerned about. And so that's really the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and companies' social license to operate in their territories, human rights and worker rights, international standards for sustainability and social issues, mitigating climate change, and then finally, disclosure of ESG responsibilities. And so that's really kind of reflecting our values and how we're investing, and the importance of using kind of the custom voting approach to do so. Right on time. Look at that. Wow.
Amazing.
I'll pass this back to you.
Okay, thank you. Merci beaucoup. On a du temps pour des questions. We have time for questions.
It's a rush.
Please, there's some microphones coming. You can ask your question in French or English. It's a bilingual country.
Can I do it in Swedish? Thank you. I have to say that I have 2 comments, one for the first paper and one for the third paper. I'm the head of corporate governance for a Swedish asset manager called Lannebo. And one of the primary drivers, I would say, for the rising demand of custom policies is that it's a geographical reason, because we are not Anglo-Saxons. And when it comes to benchmark policies, they are still quite Anglo-Saxon in their way of thinking, which means that a different governance regime makes it totally pointless to follow the main benchmarks. And it's not driven by contentious issues, it's driven by non-contentious issues. The view of remuneration programs, the view on CEO/chairman of the board, and so on, which is not something that is something seem negative in the US context, but very much so in the European context. So I think that's a huge reason. And it would be interesting to do further research on that, maybe. Just the geographical spread of the usage of custom policies, I think, is much, much, much higher in Northern Europe than it is, for instance, in the US. And on the third paper, this should be on the big stage. This should be in front of everyone. This is sad that it's this small room with these little people, because what you're actually saying is something we've been arguing for years, that much of the exclusion policy that is at least everywhere in European context is counterpoint. It's negative. And that should be huge topic of discussion for UNPRI. So instead of having just another UNPRI dignitary being in there discussing and making us feel good, this is what we should talk about. That many of the exclusive policies that exist in oil and gas and in other fields that do not, for instance, take in transition companies, are actually counter to the point we want to do. Extremely important. So please, UNPRI, put this on the big stage, paper 3, because this is so important to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, merci. Do you want some words of comments quickly?
Yeah, thank you for your comment. We cannot, unfortunately, test the geographical effect in our data because the data is anonymized. But that said, I've talked to proxy advisors in the UK, and indeed they confirmed the use of custom proxy advisors is very common there. Some of them, Minerva, for example, doesn't even provide any benchmark recommendations for its clients. It's all customized.
Thank you for your comment as well. I think we don't want to necessarily say that divestment is bad or counterproductive, but at least in the transition, it could be counterproductive. You need large-scale coordination to make it work. And the other point that we wanted to make is that there might be other strategies, such as tilting, that may be a little bit more effective in terms of enacting change within the firm. So, thank you.
So the Canadian taxonomy is coming soon, and transition is a key topic in Canada. So thank you. It's being recorded, the social media. Feel free to make some noise. We'll be happy. Any question? Yes.
Thank you. This is Boy from the University of Sydney. I have a question for Yasser. I think the paper is really interesting. One question is that, so if a company is actually starved for money, right, so in deep distress, they probably would not have the fund to actually to purchase abatement technology or things like that, right, to control pollution. So one alternative explanation is that maybe they are not really intensively try to take risk, but because it's too expensive to control pollution. And I recorded there is a paper basically showing that if firms actually fall into distress, firms actually do more M&As, especially diversifying M&As. The argument is that they take risk to try to gamble for resurrection. So I'm just wondering, can we interpret this increasing pollution intensity as risk-taking, or is that because of the cost of control pollution?
Yes, so the two channels are perfectly valid. You can think about it just as a financial constraint or as an additional risk-taking. But just to kind of add to your point, one of the results we show is that Chapter 11 restructuring can help actually reduce pollution intensity as you allow firms more financial flexibility. There is a very interesting paper by Michael Orlog, for example, that highlights that speeding up the process of bankruptcy or Chapter 11 processing can actually help reduce that period of time where you have financial distress and pollution shifting.
Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for the very thoughtful session and how you curated it. Hearing from the academics and the research was very thought-provoking and just gives us some ideas about maybe what we should be thinking about as asset owners, and then having someone summarize it made it even more accessible to kind of put it in that framework, and then bringing an asset owner to kind of reflect on what that meant in their ecosystem and their governance was very powerful. So thank you for the thoughtfulness and how you put this together.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. There's a huge academic committee working on this as well. Laura is not here today, but acknowledging the work from the community. Any other question? Pushback? Yes. Caroline.
Thanks so much. Caroline Flemmer from Columbia. I just want to actually add to the first comment about divestment and ineffectiveness. So my sense is, not just in academic research, but also in practice, our focus is way too much on the portfolio level, correct? In the sense of divestment, you clean up your portfolio, and we think way too little about what do we actually change in the real world. So basically this bridging, I love the discussion, by the way, bridging it, correct, from what's going on at asset owners level, managers, and then all the way what's actually going on the grounds, and we need to do this much more. So really to but we need language for that. We also need research for that to help support these arguments, correct? Why divestment may not be the most effective way in order to transition, if we really want to transition, stay invested, and to actively engage with portfolio companies to transition, and maybe policy engagement, etc. So anyway, just wanted to add, I do think we need a fundamental mind shift, including in academic research and in education, to move way beyond portfolio level thinking. Good question.
Who wants to react to this pushback about systems thinking? I guess it goes back to this morning conversation about shifting towards systems, and maybe more than portfolio theory is no longer accurate. It's a provocative thought here. Anyone wants to say yes, please?
It's a really interesting discussion, and I think I was in the previous discussion next door before lunch, and it was by CEC, the Climate Engagement Canada group, and all their entire mandate is about how do we engage with oil and gas instead of divesting. How do you actually have these positive relationship with them to enact change? And I think I'm hearing it loud and clear from this room that this is something that we need to talk more about. But if you're interested, look at CEC as well as an alternative way of doing this. This is being done in Canada, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done elsewhere as well.
Interesting. Any other comment, pushback? Any last thoughts you want to share? Maybe your paper has been quite popular, so do you want to say anything? About the key takeaway about divestments? What do you want the audience to take from? Do you want to encourage divestment?
I can comment, I guess, on Caroline's points. I think you are definitely spot on, and that's why we wrote this paper, trying to understand a little bit more what's happening on the real side of the economy and how firms can react to divestment or increased financing conditions. One point that I briefly touch upon in the paper, and that's equally important, is thinking about what's happening for the sale of the assets, dirty assets in particular. So for a long time, we've seen big oil companies just cleaning up their balance sheets and operations by selling some of these assets. And the idea here is you can potentially put some tax on those, reduce the value of those assets as a way to create an ex-ante financial incentives for these companies to start green in the first place.
Thank you. Vishaal, do you want to key takeaway from the audience? Do you want to share? You good?
There's a question.
Please, a question. Last question. We need a microphone here.
Thank you.
It's working.
Ayako Yasuda from UC Davis. Just following up, building up on the conversation that we are having. I think there is also a confusion about impact investing. What is impact investing, and does divesting part of impact investing? Because I think there is this pervasive view that divesting, well, there is actually two purposes of divesting is often confounded. One purpose of divesting is alignment of your portfolio with your own personal values or your own ideology. And if you are consciously doing that for that purpose, then that's a sort of a internally consistent investment approach or philosophy. But then there is other school that says divesting, when it's coordinated, becomes impact investing. And then when people are not differentiating between the two, and you doing that at your individual portfolio alone is enough to generate impact, then it becomes very, very counter-effective, as you pointed out. And I just want to hear everybody's thoughts. Maybe you could put that on your post on the social media and so forth, is that in Europe, now a definition of impact fund requires engaging in divesting. And that is, if you're doing impact investing, that's a questionable approach because you're confounding those two objectives. And that I think could be, that could be amplified in discussion at places like PRI. So if you have thoughts on that, that's something that we could, we could generate more noise, as you said.
Yeah, and I think it points to the fact to the divestment from cost funds from Enbridge for violations of Indigenous rights, which is a different modus from divestment for transition. So I think it's really important to get the sense of what you divest for and the political signal. Because we are at time, I have to conclude right now, and I'm going to invite the discussion to pursue over coffee and tea. I just want to remind everyone that we have the academic network for the PRI. The goal is a very unique interface between practitioners and academics, and all academics come here to speak to you practitioners to get your feedback and share the research. So please feel free to continue the conversation, read the research, because we need everyone to move forward. Thank you, merci beaucoup, au revoir.